Hello, everyone, and welcome to Out Here in the Redwoods. I'm Denise Ryles, and we are coming to you from our own spaces. And tonight is joining me is Elizabeth Smith, former president of the AACP. Hello, Liz.
Hello.
How are you tonight?
I'm doing well. Thank you. How are you?
Hanging in there,
Yeah.
doing the Zoom for the first time.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Okay. Yeah.
Well, Liz, I'm so glad you're joining us. You know, there is so much going on, and what we try to do here is search the canopy for news and things that really affect us here on the North Coast. And right now, not only on the North Coast, but worldwide, literally worldwide, is the Black Lives Matter movement.
Mm-hmm.
And I just have to ask you, first and foremost, with all of this, what is the conversation at home these days between you and your family? What's going on there?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's important to point out that I certainly have been raised in a very unique home in a lot of ways, and one that I would say is so different from, I would say, a good majority of the African American population, not only just on the North Coast, but I would say United States as a whole. Was born in Minneapolis, lived in the Tonga Islands in the South Pacific, where my mother is from, for a year before relocating to Humboldt County in 1987 to join my dad, who was recruited to be the head of what was then the African American Studies Department at Humboldt State University. He came a year prior in 1986 and then became chair of the Ethnic Studies Department. And so anyway, so we followed him after leaving the Tonga Islands. We were supposed to be there just for a Christmas vacation. My mom wasn't a US citizen yet. She had to renew her visa. It took almost a year. So that's why we were there. Instead of 2 weeks, we're there almost 10 months. And then from there, my dad had gotten a permanent position at Humboldt. So instead of going back to Minneapolis, we came here. So unique in the sense that, you know, my mom, from a multicultural standpoint, she's from another country,
Right.
and is bilingual. My father was a World War II veteran, Vietnam, Korea. And so he started traveling the world at age 18, also bilingual. Wow. He lived quite a bit of time in Europe. His first wife was a German Jew. So very educated, both PhDs, very worldly, very few things in common, but things they did have in common was Christianity, to be of service, and really believing that education was the greatest equalizer. And so I feel like those are important disclaimers to give before talking about conversations at home. So my home consists now of my mother, who's 76, my younger brother, who's 36 and has paranoid schizophrenia, and myself. And so, you know, certainly being in this pandemic, which really helps exacerbate, well, really any stress that's happening all over the world, right? You know, really it's kind of a matter of, what does survival look like? What does it look like to do your best to stay present in the moment, and do your best to try to have some semblance of sanity with sheltering in place, with not having the larger support system that you might be able or might be used to. You know, in my brother's case, he's been hospitalized 3 times during COVID with county and mental health, and they're wonderful. However, 3 different times since March, 3 very different instances in terms of, you know, what does safety look like in terms of visitors? What does safety look like in terms of check-in? What does safety look like in terms of staff interaction and support that he may have had on a larger scale before, now happening in a different way, right? So, for example, the last time he was there, hospitalized, was just a week and a half ago, and was feeling suicidal. So he was able to express that he needed to go there. Something in my head said, you know, you should call ahead. So I called and they said, oh, it's good that you called. Now with COVID, our latest drill is you need to go to the emergency room first. Then you essentially get a doctor's note after they do this whole battery of tests to show that you're COVID free. And then you get a pass to be able to come to Sempervirens. And so, you know, that's a whole nother funky layer of things that then occurred. So go to the emergency room at 11 a.m. He got released at 6 a.m. the next day. Well, they wouldn't admit him. Semper Virens, you couldn't even get a staff person to open up for you until 8 a.m. So then he's at home in a holding pattern for 2 hours
Oh my.
before
Wow.
then being able to call, finally get hold of a case manager at 10 a.m. and then go there. So, in terms of what's happening in the world with regards to race relations,
Mhm.
all the vitriol that's happening, Black Lives Matter, there are just certain conversations that we had, I think, just by nature of who our father was.
Mhm. And still is in spirit.
Before we even joined school. I mean, there was an indoctrination of sorts that happened before you even went to kindergarten, just letting you know. In my case, it was, you've got 3 strikes against you. You're female, you're Black, but actually you're mixed, so you're not all the way Black, so you're going to have to work 3 times harder.
Holy.
My brother got a similar message, although he's male, so he didn't have that strike necessarily, or that 3rd strike necessarily. But it's a much different dynamic to be a Black male or a male of color versus a female of color, much more threatening. And so, there were things that, a lot of the things that are happening right now and a lot of the discussions that are happening right now are discussions that we've been having in our family our whole lives. So I would say in terms of changes for us, I think the changes that are happening is there are now people who are awakening to the fact that there has been discrimination and systemic issues and violence that have been happening for decades. Now, just being able to have access to media and access to, cell phones and iPods and everything else to be able to transmit information in virtual way all over the world immediately. Now
And
you've
thank
got
goodness for
people
that.
who are able to witness things and experience things that they didn't know exist, or they'd heard maybe existed but didn't believe because they didn't experience it themselves, didn't see it themselves. In some instances, you've got folks who, like me, for the most part, haven't experienced discrimination. Well, my first real bout of that was in 2016, quite frankly, when Trump was elected. And, what happened for me, I ended up losing my job in a very public way.
Wow.
And, I won't go into that. That's a whole nother story, really. But essentially what had happened was I had the nerve to ask for a raise. And I had a couple of folks on my board, 2 white conservative men in particular, that said I had no business making that amount of money. Okay.
What
And
the
then
what?
to make my life extremely difficult. This is Christmas 2016. And then by April of 2017, I had been forced to resign. And there were a number of things that happened that I attribute directly to the election of Donald Trump, in the sense that I think with his election, there are so many issues that came to the forefront that had been so well buried in our nation, right? And so you had, in some instances, I think, permission for certain white people to be able to kind of come out of the closet about certain biases that they had towards people of color, towards, misogynistic ones, all kinds of things. And then again, for people like me, who for the most part had led a pretty privileged existence as a person of color, now was starting to experience some pretty intense discrimination that other people of color had been experiencing their entire lives. So I don't know if that makes sense. I know that was a 10-minute answer to your
No,
very
no, no.
introductory
That
question.
it makes perfect sense. And in regards to your comment about the videos and everything, thank goodness we have that. And what people have to remember is we're all journalists now.
True.
And because of the camera, we have caught some very bad people red-handed. Red-handed. There's no denying anymore that this is happening. Now in Humboldt County, I've been to a couple of rallies, and
me too.
Their concern was the racism here in town. That is subtle.
Yes.
That experience, do you find that to be true?
I do find it to be true. And quite frankly, I find it to be more dangerous than if it were more overt. From a safety standpoint, if you go into areas like the South, or ones that still are so very black and white, as you're communicating to your family members, particularly your children, you know, that's part of the warning system in terms of as soon as you leave the house, being reminded of who you are, how you should behave, and where you should and should not be, right? And here, you know, my father was part of the NAACP, a life member. With that, he got magazines like The Crisis. And so in that magazine, it was able to talk about different instances that were happening throughout the country. At one point, because his name was so just kind of plain, Nathan Smith, he had joined the Ku Klux Klan so he could get information about different things that were happening, right? So growing up here, when I moved here at age 8, I was told not to go to places like McKinleyville. I was told not to go to places like Ferndale and Centerville Beach, where there were instances where crosses were being burned.
Serious?
Right? And so there were, and then, you know, my family really didn't have any experience with cannabis culture prior to moving here. And so it was also just, you know, and also don't be going into these very rural areas unless you're invited, you know who you're with, that sort of thing. And so as far as the more covert or subtle racism here, it makes it difficult from a safety standpoint, especially to be able to communicate to children and to youth in terms of, you know, this is where you should be or not be. This is how you should react should you get pulled over on your bicycle or in your vehicle. This is how you interact with police. It's not as cut and dry anymore. Does that make sense?
You're making perfect sense, Elizabeth, perfect sense. Now, there seems to be some confusion about everything. Why do you think that is?
And when you say confusion, is that around maybe
The
what
Black
Black
Lives
Lives Matter
Matter.
stands for?
You
I
know,
think there's a lot of reasons for confusion, Denise. I think one is Black Lives Matter. I think, you know, white people have really been on attack, really, since 2016. And there are things that are happening locally that I think are incredibly dangerous. And part of that is equity alliances, different groups that are really pushing for discussions around white privilege. I think that's a dangerous term. I really do. I really do. And so you have these very cerebral, intellectual conversations about systematic discrimination and what it looks like for white people who have been in power since the United States became the United States.
Right.
And what could be done from an ally and advocacy standpoint to be able to change the systems that are continuing to create these systems of oppression and marginalization that are leading to violence, right? And I think on some level, I can't speak for you, on some level, if it feels cathartic and healing for you to have discussions around a history of privilege, okay, that's fine. But I think to be continually bombarded with the term white privilege, frankly, in this community, it is majority white. It also is not a wealthy community.
Right.
So when you go into areas like Hayfork, when you go into areas like Orick, when you go to areas all over Eureka, quite frankly, I would argue there are not a lot of white people that feel privileged. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
And so, okay, white privilege, I think, is a damaging term. Black Lives Matter, I think it then makes it that much easier to go on the defensive when you hear a statement like Black Lives Matter in the affirmative, because if you're already as a white person being told that you have privilege and don't feel empowered in any way, or that you have privilege, and then you're hearing statements like Black Lives Matter, I understand why you want to focus on all lives matter. Or does that make sense?
It
It's
does.
confusing. What does that mean, right? I also think it's confusing because the focus has been around police violence.
Right.
Okay, fine. Not to say that it's not egregious, not to say that it's not happening, not to say it's not important to focus on. However, there is the argument of when you look statistically all over the nation and you look at the number of African Americans who are killed in violent ways, the majority of those who are killed in violent ways are being killed at the hands of other Black people, right? So where are those movements then that are focusing on what we can be doing to empower ourselves, to have communities that are safer, to have communities that are more economically viable and thriving, to have communities that if you're not happy with the educational system, you have folks that are coming into those communities that are more segregated or more urban and poor, who are then creating charter schools or changing the public school systems so that it does give greater opportunities for people of color. Am I making sense?
Oh, yeah.
And so I think part of the confusion is, okay, we see the police violence, and especially when you're in an area like this, no, you don't see people of color who are experiencing those same degrees of violence as you do in a Minneapolis or an Oakland or a Detroit or a Los Angeles or in these larger urban centers where there's a larger group,
Right.
or population of people of color. So, I think, not to say that we can't empathize, and not to say that there isn't any sort of discrimination that happens here in the policing level, but I think it's confusing here for some people to know how it's really an issue here. Is it really an issue here? Or is that just really more of a product of larger urban areas? Does that make sense?
It does.
And then I think, the Black Lives Matter movement, I think the founders and what they've created is good in theory.
Mm-hmm.
I think that there are folks who have perverted the message, who are speaking louder than the founders are, who are participating and hosting protests all over the country that then become distorted and violent, and that distracts from the original message.
Right.
Does that make sense?
I understand that the people of Portland, they have been really vigilant on remember why we are here.
Sure.
Please remember why we're here.
Yeah.
We are here for equality.
Yeah.
And and holding our own accountable in our police departments.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I thought that was really cool. And that's firsthand information.
Yeah. Yeah.
Firsthand. They really have been really trying. And how is it that people can weed out those who are distorting the message? How can people be more aware of that?
I mean, as weird as it sounds, part of that is not ingesting too much from the media.
Right?
And so it's kind of a double-edged sword. In one sense, what a blessing that, like you said, we all get to be journalists.
Mm-hmm.
Most of us have the ability to be able to record in live time via
Right.
phones things that are happening around us and then distribute that information. That also then means, just like in mainstream journalism, messages can get distorted, right? Whoever the author is, whoever the person is that wants to be able to communicate what's happening, you get to decide how you want to veer your story.
Mm-hmm.
And so, part of it, you have to be able to critically think and discern whether or not you believe the information that you're ingesting. But part of it too is to not bombard yourself with constant information.
Right.
I mean, A, it's toxic. And B, I think if you don't have direct connections with people who are in these communities where these things are taking place, like you and I spoke earlier, you've got a friend who's been there literally on the ground for 50 days participating,
Right.
who's able to tell you, oh, okay, see what you're seeing on CNN or Fox or MSNBC or whatever. This is what I'm going to tell you I'm experiencing.
Right.
This is what I'm going to tell you from a bronchial level I'm getting in terms of tear gas, right?
Exactly.
This is what I can tell you in terms of the moms groups that are out there, or the dads groups that are out there, or, how white people are interacting as allies or advocates versus people of color, African Americans specifically, who are trying to direct the message more in terms of this is how we want to be supported. This is how we want to demonstrate, right?
Right.
And so I think unless you have a direct connection to these people who are on the ground and able to tell you, hey, let me bear witness and tell you exactly what's happening, and not whatever distorted information is happening, I think it's very hard to be able to know what's true and what's not.
Right. And what we're experiencing also is within this, I'll use the word propaganda.
Yeah.
Some of these things are propaganda pieces.
Sure.
There is a little bit of truth in there, and that makes it even more dangerous.
Yes. Yes.
Because my mother is very good about me fact checking. She'll call me on mine.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's great.
And you go back and you go, but there is a little bit of truth going on here. No wonder people are confused.
Yeah. Well, and and conversely, we're talking about Black Lives Matter and we're talking about police brutality.
Yeah.
What do you do if you're black and blue, right? What do you do if you're a person of color and also male and also in law enforcement? And
Right.
so I have a nephew who's in highway patrol. My best friend, my godson's father, is a parole officer in Los Angeles. My nephew's also in the greater Los Angeles area as well. And my best friend is El Salvadorian. We've been able to have very open discussions around police brutality and whatever we may see, right? In the mainstream in terms of what information we're getting for these law enforcement or police officers who are killing people of color. And it's been helpful to be able to talk to them about, how does it feel for you being in the law enforcement community? What's the brotherhood that you ascribe to more?
Right.
But also to be able to have discussions around, the majority of us don't know what it's like to feel threatened, to be in a position where you're supposed to be protecting and serving, to be in a position where you're doing crowd control. You have a lot of different things that are happening at once and what your reaction is going to be. Does that make sense?
Yes.
And so both of them have talked very openly about having more information than us as a population in terms of what these officers have faced before making the decisions to shoot, right? And that it's not as simplistic and clear cut as it may look on our end, right? I mean, we see what other facts we think we see with regards to these people who are killed.
Right.
It's a tragedy no matter what, and it's a tragedy certainly for these officers and their families as well. If you take a life, you take a life, and whether it was justified or not, it's going to affect you.
Right.
If you also followed the book and did everything that was right for you in the moment, but you're also being vilified, yeah, your life has changed. Yes. And so, I think that's also a confusing thing too, Denise, is police officers, there's defunding police and all these different movements that are happening. Really, they're not paid enough. They don't have enough support.
Right.
A lot of them are being asked to do a multitude of different jobs all at once and don't have the qualifications or the wherewithal or the support to be able to do those things. We ask a lot of them.
Oh, yeah.
I'm not saying there aren't bad apples. I'm not saying there are those that go in for malicious reasons and have no business wearing a badge. I'm not negating that at all. Mm-hmm. But I would like to say that I have had wonderful interactions with law enforcement. I can't say enough great things about our local law enforcement. Uh-oh, excuse me, my screen's doing something weird. Uh-oh. Okay.
There we go. Welcome to the
And, I had the opportunity to serve under Chief Mills for Eureka Police Department. He had started a police advisory committee, and I had the honor of being one of the 6 people who were part of that committee. And at the same time, I was serving on the Human Rights Commission. And so it was really helpful to be able to get as much inside information as was appropriate for us as a volunteer body. Mm-hmm. But just to see the various things that are asked of our law enforcement. And so, I mean, my best example would be when we had the Devil's Playground behind the mall.
Right.
And there was that push in, 2016, to be able to have those 200 some folks moved.
Right.
Well, that was the city council put that on law enforcement, and the amount of time that was demanded of them. So not only time, but also on their own to figure out how to be psychologists, social workers, case managers, housing experts.
Right.
In addition to doing policing, that's ridiculous.
Yeah.
That's ridiculous. And that's just one small example. So when you start then talking about on a day-to-day basis, what does it also look like to be politicians, to be neighborhood stewards, to be able to keep track of all of these terms, sociological terms, psychological terms. Does that make sense?
It
We
does.
ask a lot of our law enforcement. We have a lot of expectations. And
Right.
I think, unfortunately, we don't give them enough credit. We don't give them enough support, and we don't ask enough questions about why why some of this violence is becoming more and more prevalent.
Right. Right. What other term would you use besides? I use reforming.
I
You
love
know,
that. I think reform is a great
reforming,
word. Yep.
because it's not just it's actually reallocating funds and actually giving support to
Yes.
our law enforcement.
Yes.
And what I found, which I thought was very interesting, is that a large chunk of budget in in other police services have been for class action suits,
Mm.
such as I'm going to say her name, Breonna Taylor.
Yeah. Yeah.
She a lot was made over the $12 million that her family received.
Mhm.
But in order to do that, the family said, we want reform, and this is what it's going to be, or else that doesn't mean a dang thing.
Yeah.
Now, what I understand is that the taxpayers are own that money. I mean, we pay for that.
Okay.
And if the police go over their allocated monies for that area, they get a bond that
Okay.
can be paid for over and over a longer period of time. So as tax double, if what they're saying is to bring that fund out of there so
Mm.
that police would double think before they go in whole hard. Like Breonna, they went in, they didn't knock anything, and they tried hiding that.
Yeah. Okay.
And that one guy, whoops, I'm sorry, my bullet went over into the apartment next door, but I'm charged for that.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
maybe that's one of the things that we can do. And I'm really interested that you were on the advisory committee.
And I
What is
loved
it
it.
you
I
found
loved it.
most interesting there? Wow. Wow. We have just a few minutes.
Yes.
Thank you, Elizabeth, for your inspiration and talking to us about this monumental change that's happening.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Martin Luther King, change is a coming.
Yes. Yes.
Ladies and gentlemen, you have been on Out Here in the Redwoods. I'm Denise and Elizabeth Smith. See you next time.
Okay. Thank you.
You bet.